You won't believe what happened after I decided I'd had enough of the HOA, Karen next door. What started as a simple revenge plot turned into something no one could have predicted. Before we dive into today's story, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe so we can keep bringing you amazing stories like this one. Alex had always thought of his suburban neighborhood as a peaceful and pleasant place to live. Nestled on a quiet street, surrounded by manicured lawns and picturesque houses, it was the ideal environment for someone like him, who enjoyed a bit of solitude but also appreciated a sense of community. Everything about the neighborhood seemed perfect until, of course, the Homeowners Association, HOA, became involved. To most, the HOA might seem like a mere bureaucratic entity that oversees certain rules and regulations. However, to Alex, it was a constant reminder that privacy, even in one's own home, was a luxury he no longer had. It all started when Alex, feeling increasingly frustrated by the lack of privacy in his backyard, decided to install a new fence. The old one was falling apart, shoddy, crooked, and barely standing. And after months of dealing with people peering over it or barging into his yard for unsolicited chats, Alex finally had enough. The decision was made. He would put up a sturdy, high fence, the type of fence that would ensure no one could look into his backyard. At first, Alex didn't think too much of it. He knew the HOA had strict rules when it came to the aesthetics of homes in the neighborhood. Fences couldn't be too tall, certain materials were prohibited, and there were specifications regarding the colors and designs that were allowed. But Alex believed his fence met all the criteria. He had done his research and even consulted with a contractor to ensure everything was above board. The fence he chose was made from high-quality wood, painted a neutral shade of brown, and stood at exactly the height allowed by the HOA guidelines. He submitted a request to the HOA for approval, feeling confident that everything was in order. That was when Karen, the self-appointed enforcer of neighborhood standards, entered the picture. Karen had lived in the neighborhood for years, and while Alex didn't mind her initially, he soon learned that Karen had a very specific idea of how the community should operate. To her, nothing in the neighborhood was ever perfect enough. The lawns needed to be a certain height, the trees trimmed in a particular way, and the houses painted in the most subtle, tasteful hues. Even the smallest deviation from the norm would trigger her ever-watchful eyes and give her the excuse to file a complaint. And Alex's fence? Well, it had just become her latest target. Karen, who served as a member of the HOA board, was notorious for her strict interpretation of the rules. She made it her mission to ensure everyone followed the HOA's guidelines to the letter, often going out of her way to inspect yards and properties, looking for any potential violations. No one, it seemed, was exempt from her scrutiny. When she saw the new fence going up in Alex's backyard, her first instinct was to examine it, and it wasn't long before she found what she considered a flaw. One evening, as Alex was finishing up dinner, he received an email from the HOA. The subject line read, "Immediate attention required regarding your fence." He opened it, and to his surprise, the email was written in a tone far more critical than he had expected. It mentioned that his fence, despite being within the allowable height and color limits, was not approved by the HOA board, because Karen, having walked by his house earlier that day, felt that the style of the fence didn't align with the aesthetic values of the neighborhood. In essence, Karen was telling Alex that his fence was an eyesore. The email further stated that he had to remove the fence within 2 weeks or face potential fines and sanctions. Alex was taken aback. How could his fence, which complied with every rule the HOA had laid out, be considered an issue? He had followed the guidelines precisely, gone through the appropriate channels to get approval, and yet here he was facing this absurd complaint. He read the email again and again, trying to find a logical explanation for Karen's actions. But the more he read, the angrier he became. It seemed that Karen was not only willing to bend the rules to her whims, but she was also attempting to impose her personal opinions onto everyone in the neighborhood. Not wanting to let this situation escalate, Alex decided to take a stand. The next day, he called the HOA's main office to speak directly with someone about the issue. After a few minutes of being passed from one representative to another, Alex finally got in touch with Tom, the HOA president. Tom was polite but non-committal, offering little in the way of concrete answers. He acknowledged that Karen had filed a complaint, but insisted that it was a routine procedure and that the board would review the matter. Tom assured Alex that everything would be sorted out in a few days. Days passed, but nothing changed. Alex received another email from Karen, this time a more aggressive one. She mentioned that the board had made its decision and that his fence was still in violation of HOA standards. She demanded that Alex remove it immediately or face a hefty fine. Alex was now at his breaking point. He had tried to be reasonable, to work within the system, but the HOA was clearly working against him. He couldn't understand why the association, which was supposed to protect the interests of homeowners, was siding with a petty, overbearing neighbor who seemed determined to dictate how everyone should live. Determined to resolve the issue once and for all, Alex decided to attend the next HOA meeting in person. He figured that by presenting his case face-to-face, he could show the board that his fence was not only compliant, but a reasonable and appropriate addition to his property. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening, and Alex cleared his schedule to make sure he could be there. When the day finally arrived, he donned his best suit, hoping to appear professional and calm, despite the growing frustration inside him. The meeting was held at the local community center, a small building near the entrance of the neighborhood. When Alex arrived, he noticed several neighbors milling around in the lobby, chatting and waiting for the meeting to begin. As he walked inside the main room, he saw Karen already sitting at the front, smugly typing away on her phone. She didn't even look up as Alex took a seat near the back, but he could feel her gaze on him. It was as if she already knew she was about to win. When the meeting started, the HOA board went through their usual routine, talking about neighborhood landscaping, trash collection schedules, and other minor issues. But when Alex's fence issue was brought up, Karen was ready. She stood up, addressing the board in a voice dripping with authority. As you can see, Karen began, pointing to a few photos of Alex's fence that she had taken without his permission. This fence does not meet the HOA's aesthetic guidelines. It is too tall and doesn't blend with the overall look of the neighborhood. The board nodded in agreement, though Alex could see a few members exchanging uncomfortable glances. They knew Karen's reputation, and it was clear that they were hesitant to get involved in this petty dispute. When it was Alex's turn to speak, he stood up and calmly explained the situation. He went over the measurements, the materials, and the HOA guidelines. He had followed every rule to the letter. He also pointed out that the fence was, in fact, more tasteful than the broken eyesore that had been there previously. The board members listened politely, but it was clear that Karen had already made up their minds for them. They quickly voted to uphold the decision, stating that Alex would need to remove the fence and replace it with something more in line with Karen's personal preferences. The final blow came when the president, Tom, offered a faint apology but reiterated that the board's decision was final. "We're just trying to maintain a certain look for the neighborhood," he said with a shrug. Alex left the meeting feeling defeated. The system was broken, and he had no way of fighting back. Little did he know, this would not be the end of his battle with Karen and the HOA. In fact, it would mark the beginning of a far more dramatic turn of events. It was time for Alex to take matters into his own hands, and what happened next would be something that none of them could have ever predicted. After the HOA board's decision, Alex felt as though he had been trapped in a no-win situation. Not only had the HOA forced him to tear down his fence, but they had also sided with Karen, a woman who seemed to think she had an almost godlike authority over everyone in the neighborhood. For weeks, Alex had been stewing in frustration, pacing back and forth in his house, running the events of that fateful meeting over and over in his mind. How could they do this to him? How could Karen, with her self-righteous attitude, get away with controlling everyone's lives? Initially, Alex had followed the rules, obeyed the guidelines, and respected the HOA process. He had put in the effort to make sure everything was within the constraints, but he now realized that none of it mattered. The HOA was not interested in fairness or compromise. They were simply interested in protecting their little clique and pleasing Karen. The thought gnawed at him, especially when he spent time in his backyard, where the new fence had once been a symbol of his independence, only to be replaced with a bland, regulation-approved structure. Alex could barely look out his window without feeling a searing sense of injustice. Karen, meanwhile, seemed to grow even bolder. After the HOA voted to have Alex's fence removed, she began parading around the neighborhood as though she had won some monumental victory. It wasn't enough for her to simply gloat. No, Karen had to make sure that everyone knew she had saved the neighborhood from another unsightly addition. Whenever Alex saw her, she would shoot him a smug smile, or, even worse, stop by his property to inspect the workmen who were tearing down his fence, offering unsolicited commentary about the ugliness of the previous one. It made Alex sick. The fact that she could wield so much power over his life was infuriating, and no amount of reasoning or diplomacy seemed to be getting through to her. Alex's initial attempts to appeal the decision fell flat. His calls to the HOA went unanswered, and when he did manage to speak to someone, they simply reiterated that the decision was final. The idea of having to live with such an oppressive atmosphere was unbearable, and so he began plotting. If he couldn't beat Karen through conventional means, he would have to do something truly outrageous, something that would get the HOA's attention and remind Karen that not everyone could be controlled. The more Alex thought about it, the more he realized that his only option was to fight back. The idea came to him one evening while scrolling through the internet. Alex had been browsing through some obscure forums, looking for ways to get back at overbearing neighbors. That was when he stumbled upon a conversation about something unexpected, using tarantulas as a form of revenge. At first, he was taken aback by the sheer absurdity of it. Tarantulas? He couldn't help but laugh at the thought. But as he read more, he discovered that there were people who had used tarantulas to get back at those who had wronged them. They had placed these creatures in their enemies' homes, cars, and even their workplaces. Some had done it just for the thrill, while others had used it as a final push to drive their targets out of the neighborhood. The more Alex thought about it, the more intrigued he became. What better way to remind Karen that she wasn't invincible than by throwing something unpredictable and terrifying into the mix? Of course, Alex didn't want to do anything that would harm anyone, but he realized that a carefully planned prank using tarantulas could get his point across. The more he thought about it, the more it felt like the perfect solution. He wasn't trying to destroy Karen's life, but he wanted to make sure that she would think twice before ever crossing him or anyone else again. Alex knew that he had to be careful. The last thing he wanted was to get caught or have his revenge blow up in his face. He started researching where to acquire the spiders, as well as the best way to transport and release them. There were, surprisingly, online suppliers who dealt in exotic creatures, and after some discreet inquiries, Alex found a reputable source. They offered tarantulas of various sizes and species, and for a price, Alex could have as many as he needed. He wasn't interested in harming anyone, so he decided that he would use a species that was relatively harmless but still enough to send a strong message. He also figured that it would be best to avoid any tarantulas that could be deadly or too aggressive. He was looking for a psychological effect, more than anything else. After much deliberation, Alex decided on acquiring 10,000 tarantulas. He wanted to make sure that the message would be loud and clear. The tarantulas would be released at the HOA Clubhouse, which was where most of the board members, including Karen, gathered for their meetings and events. It was the heart of the HOA's operations, and Alex knew that if he could disrupt it, he would have made his point in a way that no one would forget. The thought of Karen sitting there, perhaps in the middle of one of her smug little board meetings, when thousands of tarantulas swarmed and would be the ultimate payback. The logistics were complicated, but Alex was meticulous. He reached out to the supplier, placed the order, and arranged for the tarantulas to be delivered to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The warehouse was the perfect location for him to keep the spiders until the right moment, hidden away from any prying eyes. In the days leading up to the planned release, Alex grew increasingly nervous. It wasn't that he was afraid of the tarantulas. It was more that he was beginning to feel the weight of what he was about to do. He was about to break every norm of civility in the neighborhood, to escalate the situation in a way that could never be undone. But the more Alex thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just about revenge. It was about taking control of a situation where he had been powerless for far too long. This was about standing up to someone who had tried to impose her will on his life without any regard for fairness or decency. If he had to go to extreme measures to show Karen and the HOA that he would no longer be a pushover, then so be it. The day of the operation arrived. Alex spent the entire morning preparing. He packed the tarantulas into large containers, making sure they were safely contained. He used a van to transport them, taking care to avoid any suspicion as he drove towards the HOA clubhouse. His heart raced as he parked the van in a nearby lot, out of view of the building. As he unloaded the containers one by one, he realized that this moment, this prank, was something he would never be able to undo. If it worked, he would have made a statement. If it didn't, well, there was no telling what kind of chaos it could cause. With everything in place, Alex took a deep breath and made his way to the clubhouse. He had already scoped out the building, identifying weak points where he could slip the containers in unnoticed. The HOA clubhouse was a nondescript building with a small back entrance that was rarely used. It was there that Alex began his work. He set the containers down near the entrance, where he could open them discreetly. He took one last look around to make sure no one was watching and opened the first container. Within moments, the tarantulas scurried out in all directions, and Alex felt a thrill surge through him. He quickly moved on to the next container, and the process repeated. It wasn't long before the entire area was teeming with tarantulas. Alex had been preparing for weeks, carefully mapping out every detail of his plan. The tarantulas were now safely released in the back of the HOA clubhouse, and he was nearly finished with his task. He stepped back, taking a moment to survey the chaotic scene before him, watching as thousands of tarantulas swarmed through the cracks in the foundation, under doors, and into the building itself. He felt a strange mixture of triumph and nervous anticipation. The deed had been done. The HOA clubhouse was meant to be a place of business, where board members gathered to plan community events and review complaints. However, as Alex stepped away from the scene, the visual of tarantulas crawling across the floors, walls, and chairs seemed like an effective way to undermine the entire association. What Alex hadn't anticipated, though, was the absolute scale of the havoc he had just unleashed. He knew it was a bold statement, but he couldn't help but wonder whether it had crossed a line, whether his revenge would come at a price. Once Alex had ensured that all the tarantulas were released, he quickly retreated from the scene. He felt his pulse quicken as he jumped into his van, the excitement now giving way to the anxiety of what was to come. In the back of his mind, Alex couldn't shake the thought, what happens next? He drove home, trying to maintain his composure, but his thoughts kept racing. He wondered if anyone would notice immediately, or if the tarantulas would go unnoticed for a while. It was a strange sensation, satisfaction mixed with dread. By the time Alex had arrived home, it was late in the evening. He couldn't bring himself to watch the HOA clubhouse as it sat in the distance. Instead, he poured himself a drink and sat in silence, his mind swirling with both excitement and guilt. As much as he had wanted to get back at Karen and the HOA, he had also realized that this act could have unintended consequences that would ripple through the entire neighborhood. He hadn't expected the HOA to retaliate this way. The following morning, Alex woke up to an alarming series of notifications on his phone. The first message came from a neighbor, someone he had never spoken to before. The message simply read, "Are you behind this tarantula invasion?" Alex's stomach dropped. The word had already spread like wildfire. People were freaking out, and Alex could already feel the tension in the air. He tried to remain calm, but the texts kept coming, one after another, all asking the same question. They were all connected to the same incident, the event that no one could explain. A few hours later, the HOA sent out an official statement to all homeowners in the neighborhood. It was a brief and serious message, warning residents that there had been an unexplained breach at the clubhouse, leading to the infestation of several thousand tarantulas. The message claimed that the building was now being professionally fumigated, and all HOA operations were suspended until further notice. Alex couldn't help but chuckle at the absurdity of the situation. A neighborhood meeting was scheduled for later that evening, and, according to the message, attendance was mandatory. He didn't know whether to be scared or amused by the turn of events. As the day went on, it became evident that the consequences of his actions were more significant than Alex had anticipated. News outlets began picking up the story, referring to the infestation as a prank gone wrong. The story spread far beyond the HOA community, catching the attention of local news stations. As reporters arrived on the scene, images of the tarantula-covered clubhouse circulated on social media. The public reaction was a mix of horror, fascination, and amusement. Some people found it comical, calling it the best prank of the year, while others deemed it irresponsible and reckless. Still, the story was dominating the news cycle, and Alex found himself both the subject of public curiosity and public ire. By the time the evening HOA meeting rolled around, Alex knew he had to attend. Despite the guilt gnawing at him, he understood that avoiding the meeting would only make things worse. The HOA would want answers, and Karen, who had spent years enforcing her rule over the neighborhood, would undoubtedly make an appearance. This time, Alex would be prepared. When he arrived at the community center, the building was abuzz with gossip and tension. Neighbors who had once avoided speaking to each other were now huddling together, discussing the situation. As Alex walked into the meeting room, a hush fell over the crowd. All eyes were on him. Karen, seated at the front, looked particularly smug. She had probably already prepared her speech about how the HOA needed to regain control of the situation, and she was ready to lay the blame at Alex's feet. Tom, the president of the HOA, stood at the front, looking equally flustered. He cleared his throat as the meeting began and immediately addressed the elephant in the room. Ladies and gentlemen, I know you're all here to discuss the unfortunate events at the clubhouse yesterday. We've all seen the chaos that the tarantulas have caused, Tom began, pausing for effect as the murmurs of the crowd quieted. We are in the process of ensuring the building is thoroughly fumigated and cleaned. This was not only an inconvenience, but a threat to the safety of our neighborhood. Alex sat up straight, feeling the weight of everyone's gaze on him. He could hear Karen's voice in the background, muttering under her breath, "Someone needs to take responsibility for this." He held his breath, waiting for the moment when he would be named the culprit. It didn't take long. Tom looked directly at Alex and gestured for him to speak. "Alex, as one of our residents, do you have anything to say about this incident?" Alex rose from his seat, feeling the eyes of the entire room on him. He had been planning this moment in his head for hours. "Well," Alex began, taking a deep breath, "I know you're all upset, and I understand why you might be blaming me. But I can assure you, the situation yesterday was the result of actions beyond my control." The room erupted in whispers, and Karen's face reddened. Alex continued, "But I have to say, it's been made very clear that we live in a neighborhood where rules are enforced without question, where personal choices are disregarded, and where one person, Karen, seems to think she holds power over everyone. I wasn't happy with the way things were being run, so I made a decision. Perhaps it wasn't the best decision, but it was one I felt I had to make to get your attention. And it did. Whether you like it or not, you're all talking about it now." Karen shot him an icy glare, but she didn't interrupt. Alex's words were having the intended effect. The room had fallen silent, and people were starting to see the deeper issue that Alex had been dealing with. Tom, visibly rattled, looked at Karen for support, but she had no words. "I will accept whatever consequences come from this," Alex continued, his voice steady. "But I want to make it clear that I'm not sorry for standing up for myself. I will continue to fight for my rights, just as I'm sure you'll continue to fight for your own." The meeting went on for another hour with heated discussions, but Alex had made his point. The HOA wasn't just a small group of petty rules. It was a force that had taken control of his life and the lives of many others in the neighborhood. And now, they were finally aware of the consequences of their actions. Whether it was the tarantulas or Alex's refusal to bow down, something had changed. The HOA would never be the same.